Good morning and welcome to this discussion on the recent unrest in Kazakhstan. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO of the Center for New American Security. As those of you who are tuning in no doubt have read or seen, protests broke out on January 2nd in a small oil-producing town in western Kazakhstan in response to the lifting of price caps on energy, including the gas that fuels many of the cars in Kazakhstan. Those protests quickly spread across the nation. By all the accounts, those protests were initially peaceful, but that didn't seem to endure. The government put back the price caps, but by January 5th, the protests turned violent, and there were reports of massive looting and burning of government buildings, especially in Almaty, the business capital of the country. More than 150 people are reported to have been killed, and thousands have been arrested since the unrest broke out. President Tokayev called in Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, this organization of former Soviet states, to help regain control of the spiraling situation. This is the first time the CSTO has ever mobilized for an operation, and Russian troops came in. Tokayev announced on Tuesday of this week that calm had been restored and that the CSTO troops would leave the country within 10 days. According to some reporting this morning, Russian troops are starting to depart. The head of Kazakhstan's National Security Committee and a well-known interlocutor in Washington, Karim Asimov, was arrested on January 8th on charges of treason. And so there's speculation about an internal power struggle between former President Nazarbayev and his supporters and current President Tokayev. But there's a lot of questions that still remain, including about the implications of the protests and the deployment of CSTO troops to help reestablish order, about the fragility of the political situation in Kazakhstan, about Russia's influence, and where things go from here, whether President Tokayev will bring in some much needed political reforms and root out corruption, which was the initial demand of the peaceful protesters, whether this will lead Russia to consolidate its influence over Kazakhstan, and how China will react, which depends on Kazakhstan for energy and uranium, among other things. So to answer these and other questions, we have a very distinguished panel of experts here. Reed Standish is a correspondent for RFERL. He's focused on China in Eurasia. He previously worked for Foreign Policy Magazine in Washington and Moscow, and he's reported across Europe and Central Asia for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and Politico Europe. Paul Stronsky is a senior fellow in Carnegie's Russia and Eurasia program. His research focuses on the relationship between Russia and neighboring countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. He previously was a senior analyst at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence Research and was director for Russia and Central Asia on the NSC staff. Andrea Kendall-Taylor is the director of transatlantic security at CNAS. She was for 8 years a senior intelligence officer before joining CNAS, and served, among other things, as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And last but not least, Lisa Curtis is CNAS Director for Indo-Pacific Security. Until about a year ago, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and NSC Senior Director for South and Central Asia for about 4 years. And previous to that has a couple of decades of government service in the CIA, the State Department, in the Senate. And she was in Kazakhstan a number of weeks ago, and may be able to tell us some impressions based on that. But let's start with you, Reed, if we may, and maybe you can just walk us through kind of the latest developments, what happened over the last 10 days or so. And, you know, it's not that long ago that we would often refer to Kazakhstan as the most stable, settled Central Asian country. And now that's the furthest thing from what the pictures on the TV and the articles in the paper suggest. So what happened? How did it happen? And did anybody predict this?
Okay, I mean, I think you've given a pretty good overview, but I'm happy to fill in a few more of those details. So, I mean, I think you're quite right in to say that, Kazakhstan has had this reputation as being this, bulwark of stability within Central Asia. And I think a lot of that has come, through Nursultan Nazarbayev, who's until 2019, was the first and only president of Kazakhstan, who had effectively been overseeing Kazakhstan since it was part of the Soviet Union. So when he stepped down in 2019, he handed power over to Tokayev, who's been president ever since. And so under Tokayev's watch, there's been, dimming economic prospects, lots of issues over prices, inflation, and just the lack of political reforms and building frustration, which has been bubbling out. And, it's come out at different points over the years. So I think that there has been, as much as perhaps this hasn't looked like it on the surface, there has been a pressure cooker building up for decades, really. So, but with this most recent episode, it was initially sparked with, as you said, fuel prices back on January 2nd in the west of the country, and things quickly spread. They swelled across the country, and they really took in wider discontent. And a lot of that was directed towards Nazarbayev, who, despite stepping down as president, he still maintained a role and was extremely influential within the country's domestic and foreign policy. So a lot of, anger over corruption, the autocratic rule, as well as just, general economic inequality, and, life not getting better for a lot of people. And then since then, things turned violent. I mean, there's still a lot of ambiguity and big unknowns about what happened, on the streets in Almaty, the largest city in particular, in terms of violence, whether, likely there was, just some protesters who felt that they had enough. It looked like there was some rioting, there was some looting, in addition to the peaceful protesters. But then there also was some people who showed up with small arms. They had guns, they had rifles, and we saw a lot of fighting with security services on the street, buildings being stormed. That then led to Tokayev obviously declaring a state of emergency. He invoked, a military intervention through the CSTO, which is this military alliance, which this is its first time actually intervening in a member. So that in itself is quite notable. And the CSTO was mostly made up of Russian forces. So right now, as kind of the fog is lifting a little bit, there's been internet blackouts across the country, and there's very few journalists, even fewer foreign journalists. They barred entry to foreign nationals into Kazakhstan for some time. So there's a big information blockade as the government let it crack down. And right now the official death toll is at, I believe, 164. And Tokayev has said that hundreds of civilians and security forces have also been, killed and injured. And then really we see a new narrative, new talking points coming from the government, which have then been picked up by Russia and China, saying that this is the work of foreign trained terrorists, and also, talking about an attempted coup d'etat. You talked about Karim Masimov. He seems to be the one where the blame is being laid mostly right now. In comments today, I believe Tokayev said that in addition for treason, he's being charged with actions aimed at forcibly seizing power. So it also shows that there's some elite infighting, which is, there's always this shadowy world of, the movers and shakers of Kazakhstan. It's an oil-rich country. There's a lot of money. A lot of people at the top have gotten very, very rich. And so there's a lot of, that political and business world is very intermixed in the country. So yeah, we're entering a really kind of unprecedented period for the country. I think it has big ripple effects across Central Asia, and then also into Russia and China especially.
Great. And Reed, do we know anything about the role of Nursultan Nazarbayev in any of this, or where he is now, or his profile now, or his standing after any of this?
I mean, his whereabouts, he hasn't been seen in public. Obviously when these protests were happening, in some pretty dramatic scenes, we saw, protesters pulling down statues of him across the country, shouting "Old man, go!" which are pretty unexpected scenes to be seen in Kazakhstan. His press secretary, his spokesman, said that he's still in Nur-Sultan, the capital, which was until 2019 when he stepped down, that was called Astana. And Tokayev's first order of business actually was to rename the capital in Nazarbayev's honor. So, I mean, it looks increasingly like he's lost out or is on the sidelines of whatever kind of elite power battle actually took place. Again, you know, a lot of that we don't know, and, you know, perhaps we won't really know all the details ever. But I think that that's by also bringing in the Russians through the CSTO. I think Tokayev was trying to send a signal to a lot of the other elites that, okay, like, Putin is in my corner now, so you need to consolidate around me. You know, Russia is extremely influential within the country, as much as China is a big player economically. You know, when it comes to the elites, when it comes to the big kind of political levers that exist within Kazakhstan, those largely still flow through the Kremlin. So having that Moscow backing, I think, is quite crucial for any kind of like elite jostling that's been going on in Kazakhstan.
That's a great segue. Paul, let me bring you in on the Russian role here. So maybe to state the obvious, everybody in Washington has been quite focused on Russian troops in Ukraine, not Russian troops in Kazakhstan, but here we are. Is this just do you see this as just a total coincidence of timing, and do you see any implications for the one from the other in Russian decision making? And maybe you could also talk about what this means for the CSTO, given that most people in Washington probably had not even heard of the CSTO until suddenly they're deploying a couple of thousand Russian troops, having been called upon to do so by President Tokayev.
Certainly, I'm happy to do so and happy to be here. First of all, I would just like to sort of reiterate something that Reed highlighted. There's a lot we don't know about the situation. There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot that's pure speculation, a lot that's pure conspiracy theory, and it's unlikely that we will actually get clear eyes on that in the coming weeks and perhaps even coming months about why this violence took place and all the inter-elite struggles that happened. But there are a few things we do know. And one is that Russia clearly sees Kazakhstan as one of the most important states in its immediate neighborhood. We all were expecting to be discussing Ukraine and Russian-Ukrainian relations at this time. But this is the first time, as both of you have said, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is sort of Russia's equivalent to NATO. It is a body of former Soviet states, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Armenia, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, that has a mutual defense treaty, very similar to NATO. However, the one difference is that this organization has never really put boots on the ground under the CSTO auspices before. There have been numerous times when one would expect the CSTO to act, including in 2010 during some ethnic violence in Kyrgyzstan, where the president of that country at that time requested assistance and the CSTO stood on the sidelines. And then just over in the past 2 years, there's been 3 times when you could have plausibly seen the CSTO deploy. The first was a very similar situation in Kyrgyzstan, where protests became violent, leading to an inter-elite struggle. CSTO stood on the sidelines during some ethnic fighting on the Kyrgyz-Tajik border. Again, they were on the sidelines. And then in November of 2020, there was a border incursion into Armenia from Azerbaijani troops. And I know I was with an Armenian official who got a phone call and was told that Putin told them that not to ask for a CSTO assistance. So all of that to me suggests that for Russia, Kazakhstan is key. And I think Kazakhstan is key for a few reasons. One, it has a long unprotected border. It's longer than the US-Canadian border. It is the second biggest economy in the Eurasian Union. So Russia, there's cross-border economic ties, and Russia doesn't want to be seen as sort of losing out on that. And then there's the strong security relationship between the two countries as well. The fact that I would argue, Mr. Nazarbayev, people don't like him now in Kazakhstan, but he's done a couple, good things. I mean, he carved out sovereignty for that state. He created a It's a very difficult geographic environment. You have two very powerful states who occasionally make claims on Kazakh land, and he's been able to push back on that. And he's been able to have a close relationship with Russia, a close relationship with China, as I'm sure we'll hear from Lisa Curtis, also a good relationship with the United States. So he's been able to carve that out. And many of the other CSTO states, either because of geopolitical isolation or geographic isolation, don't have that option. So this is one way in which Russia could reassert a lot of its influence here. I would also argue, many people, including me, have dismissed the CSTO almost like a paper tiger. But this sort of shows that it can act quickly, and that Putin either can get a coalition, or he can, of the willing, or he can coerce other states into acting quickly, and into providing sort of the cover for Russian troops. There was about 2,500 Russian troops that came in. Everybody else had very minor contingents, 200-300 troops coming in. So it was largely a Russian intervention under CSTO auspices, and that certainly suggests that it can rally its allies, including, this was not a popular intervention in places like Armenia or Kyrgyzstan, both of which didn't get help from the CSTO in recent years. So their people didn't particularly want to go. And Kazakhstan-Kyrgyz relations are quite complex, so they didn't want to have Kyrgyz on the ground. Kyrgyz didn't want to send Kyrgyz on the ground. All that said, I think for the CSTO and for Russia, it tells us a few things. First, Russia is very opportunistic. I don't think Russia saw this coming either. I don't think anybody really saw this coming. But Russia was clearly on the phone, saw an opportunity, saw some elite struggles, and stepped in, and is now has more influence because it helped turn the tide in Mr. Tokayev's favor, and it did so within 3 days. And I think we were just getting, the US side was just getting our public statements out by the time the Russians were actually coming in. So we seemed to be a little bit flat-footed, and the Russians were already acting. I think it also shows that the Russians they may have learned from 2014. We have a regime, a close Russian ally that was shaky, that had instability, and the Russians stepped in before it all went crashing down. So they didn't have to do what they did in 2014. In some ways, that's positive. This was an internal Kazakh struggle, and the violence was Kazakh related. And I hopefully this means that for all our humming and hawing and disliking the Russians, they at least, for now, the indications are that they may be leaving, and that's good. So I think they've been able to sort of keep Kazakhstan in its orbit, probably shore up its influence, perhaps gain greater influence over Kazakhstani's sovereign decision making, but without actually doing anything to Kazakhstani's sovereign territory. And I think, at least for the Kazakh people, we're not going to see a repeat of what's happened in Ukraine, which I think is good. But I also think, it shows that Russia is not afraid of being stretched. It has the capacity to deal with short, interventions, and it is, able to handle. The tension on Ukraine is still continuing, so this doesn't seem to be really impacting the Russian calculations at that point. And I'll turn it over back to you.
Great. Andrea, let me go to you. I'd be interested in your take on this connection, whether you have the same sense as Paul on the connection or lack thereof between Russia's activities in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan, and whether the one will influence their thinking or decision-making on the other. And also how, you're also have looked at authoritarian politics to a great degree. And is this look to you sort of like the standard authoritarian playbook of, you have unrest in the streets, you blame it on some foreign instigators, you send your local security forces out to try to deal with it. If that doesn't work, you get some outside help, and then you hope to God that that outside help gets sent packing back to where it came from before it poses a bigger problem for you down the line. I mean, is this pretty standard, or do you see something exceptional in this?
Okay, good questions. Those were excellent points by both Reed and Paul. But I do, on the kind of connection to Ukraine, I mean, I agree with what Paul just said, is that there's unlikely to be any real significant connections in the way that the events in Kazakhstan affect the Kremlin's thinking about what's happening in Ukraine. As both have emphasized, Kazakhstan was a sudden development. It came out of nowhere. It was very much a black swan. No one was expecting it, including the Kremlin. And now they've very quickly deployed a small force. It is just about 2,500 forces. And they've already announced that they're going home, within 10 days, likely. I think they may have some conditions about when the forces will be entirely removed, but they're already making plans to pack up and go home. And so it's a small force. It's a short operation. And so this is yet another example, I think, of Russia's ability to use a relatively limited intervention for outsized political influence, because what Paul said is correct. I mean, this is an opportunity for Russia to extend its influence. Nazarbayev, for a very long time, pursued this multi-vector foreign policy. And now I think Tokayev is in many ways beholden to Putin. I mean, he really did. He called in Putin, I think, to signal to his security forces. At the beginning of this, we did see some elite defections. And I think, looking at protest situations, that's when these protests get worrisome, is when you have members of the elite and members of the security forces defecting to the opposition. That is what the signs of a protest that are more likely to be successful. And recognizing that very quickly, I think Tokayev called in Russia in order to curb those defections and help shore up his regime. So again, just short, limited operation that's going to give Russia some maximum political advantage, I think, in Kazakhstan. But maybe there's one way that it might affect Kremlin's calculus, and it's not really consequential in any way. But if anything, I think it can reinforce Putin's resolve to get the United States out of Europe, out of Eastern Europe, to kind of mitigate U.S. role in Europe's security architecture. Because for Putin, this is another example of a color revolution. I mean, we know that's an organizing principle for Putin. He said as much. This is to your question about he views this largely as resulting from outside forces, namely from the West. And it is, Putin, part of Putinism I think he sees it as its own personal responsibility to push back on these color revolutions, to push back on what he sees as US unilateralism. This has become a very personal issue for Putin. And so he's not going to allow, an embattled dictator to be overthrown in the streets, because that ultimately is a threat to his own hold on power. So for Putin, it very likely, just can reinforce his resolve in wanting to push his maximalist requests of the United States and Europe, given that he, continues to see himself as being embattled and under threat from the U.S. In terms of the dynamics of authoritarian regimes, I guess I would say in some ways there's an element of surprise to me. So we've done some work recently. It was actually in the context of thinking about Putin's succession and how that might unfold. We started looking at all longtime authoritarian leaders, highly personalist leaders, and those leaders in power for 20 years or more, to try to understand how they leave office. And by far and away, the most common trajectory is that these longtime leaders end up dying in office. When we looked at the sample, longtime leaders like Nazarbayev and like Putin, for that matter, 40% die in office. And if you add an element of older leaders, so to factor in that aging element, so those leaders that are personalists 20 years or longer and 65 years or older, it's 50% die in office. And so what tends to happen in these regimes is they kind of they're in an equilibrium. And they often, and the longer leaders are in power, the less likely it is to happen at the hands of insiders. So that's one thing. So there is an element of surprise that so late in the game, after Nazarbayev, even though he had stepped down, he continued to wield power in the background. So the fact that protests have now caused him to step aside is surprising in some regard. That said, protests were the second most common way that longtime leaders were forced to step down. So I guess in that way, it's a lesser likelihood, but still not entirely implausible. So I can end there, but I think, the bottom line is, not a significant impact on how Russia is thinking about what's happening in Ukraine, underscoring Paul's point about how important this is for Putin personally, to shore up an embattled dictator and to demonstrate that leaders should not be ousted at the hands of protesters on the streets. And I think there is also a geopolitical element. I think that point that Paul made is so important about Russia now demonstrating its ability to rally a coalition to respond. I mean, there is a geopolitical element in this, and that Putin continues to build his credibility as someone who is a loyal and credible backer of embattled dictators. And it's not, it's Lukashenko. It's now here, Tokayev. It was in Venezuela. It was in Syria. So there is kind of that geopolitical element to that, which I think we shouldn't underestimate for other kind of authoritarians and would-be authoritarians who know who to call if they need help.
Great. Lisa, let me go to you. In November, you were in Kazakhstan. I think you were in Almaty, not Nur-Sultan /Astana / its other names, and we'll see how long the name Nur-Sultan lasts, if it does. I think you were in Almaty. But were you in Almaty? Well, you can tell us. You can tell us, rather than me guessing, you can tell us where you were. But the question is, was there any hint in the air in the conversations, including with Kazakh officials and things like that, that something like this may be a matter of weeks away, or was this just sort of a bolt from the blue in that respect? And then the second question I just wanted to ask you is about the U.S. response so far. What do you make of it? What was it? And what do you make of it?
Well, I think that, first of all, I was in Nur-Sultan, formerly Astana, not Almaty. And I was there for an international conference looking at geopolitical trends, both in the region and globally. So unfortunately, there was not a lot of discussion about what was happening in Kazakhstan internally. And one thing I noticed was how much more developed Astana or Nur-Sultan was from when I had visited 4 years ago. Much more traffic on the streets, more construction, much more economically vibrant. So perhaps that has something to do with the combustion of the recent protests that we have seen. Sort of rising economics, but then a lot of difficulty since COVID and in the short term, and the raising of the energy prices. But I think what the focus was when I was there, like I said, was Kazakhstan's foreign policy. And the major topics were really Afghanistan, the situation there, and China. And the Kazakhstan leadership was interested in trying to help deal with the crisis in Afghanistan, the humanitarian crisis. They're sending wheat flour to help with the food shortages. Kazakhstan has allowed an air bridge to ferry UN staff and humanitarian aid and workers from Almaty to Kabul. They want to continue their women education programs, continue to encourage human rights. So really, Kazakhstan was showing a lot of interest in trying to help the United States with the situation in Afghanistan. But there was also concern about China. China had stopped imports from Kazakhstan, even though China continued to send many of its goods across the rail line that transits Kazakhstan to Europe. So there were some questions about, what was happening there. Some of the experts I talked to indicated some Chinese unhappiness that the Kazakhstan authorities had not done enough to deal with anti-China sentiment that had been brewing in Kazakhstan. So I think that's a really interesting aspect of this situation, to look at how is China going to react. Of course, they would support stability being brought quickly. They supported Russian troops going in to bring that stability, so that they would certainly support that. But over the longer term, what do they think about Russia asserting more of its hegemonic influence in Central Asia? And, given their economic goals, and that Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan, is a central part of their Belt and Road initiative. So even though I did not detect this brewing protests in the kinds of demonstrations that we saw while I was there, it's also not surprising, getting back to, I think, a point that Paul or Reed made, because, 2.5 years ago, when you had the presidential election, there was a lot of frustration. There were many protests that had to be put down. So it's quite clear that the Kazakhstan people are hungry for political reform. They're hungry for their government to be more responsive to their wishes. And so I think it's clear that President Tokayev moving forward is going to have to respond to these growing political sentiments from the Kazakhstan people. Now, during his speech to Parliament on Tuesday, President Tokayev did talk about the need to rein in corruption, to deal with economic inequality in the country, to move swiftly on political modernization. So he said some of the right things, but the question is, are these steps going to be enough? Is he going to move fast enough to meet the dissatisfaction that's clearly there? With regard to the second part of your question, which was, how the U.S. should respond. Well, so far we have seen Secretary of State Blinken, number one, question if you invite Russian troops into your house, how quickly are they going to leave? So, signaling U.S. discomfort with Russia sending troops there, as well as really criticizing the shoot-to-kill orders that President Tokayev gave. Other than that, I think the U.S. response has been somewhat muted, and but I think at right now that is the right posture for the U.S. Certainly, we have to stand up for human rights in Kazakhstan, but really, it's a time for the U.S. to monitor closely, pay attention, find out the facts. What has actually happened, and recognize that this should be a crossroads moment where the U.S. recognizes the importance of Central Asia. I think too often in the past, U.S. policymakers have sort of downplayed the significance of Central Asia, or have sort of written it off. Well, that's Russia's sphere of influence. But the fact is that the Central Asian countries look to the United States to support their independence and sovereignty. So I don't buy the argument that the U.S. has no leverage in Central Asia. We do, and that is because we do support the sovereignty and independence of these nations. And we need to redouble our efforts with the engagement, the C5+1 engagement, which is the U.S. engages at the same time with all 5 Central Asian republics. This has been a very effective form of engagement. And what the United States is doing through this engagement is it's encouraging the Central Asian states to cooperate with each other. Because I think what we see is that Central Asian countries that are working together, that have economic linkages, and are dealing with any kind of disputes that they have in a peaceful manner, will be a stronger region, and they'll be able to protect that independence and sovereignty of the region as well as the individual nations. So this is certainly not a moment for the U.S. to recoil from our engagement in Central Asia. It really is a moment that we need to stay engaged, watch closely, and try to understand the implications of what has happened. It really is a remarkable moment in many ways. And even though the protests have tamped down pretty quickly, it's something that I think has shifted the geopolitical calculations of Russia, China, and the Central Asian states themselves. And they're watching very closely to see how the United States reacts.
Great. I want to invite those who are tuning in to send in any questions you have. I'm going to continue with my questions, but I'll feed in some of the ones that you guys have. So I think you can just put them in the chat or ask a question, and we'll try to get to those. So go ahead if you have them. Reed, I want to go back to you on this China question. So the Chinese, maybe not very surprisingly, said that they supported the Russian intervention, that China opposes, color revolution in Kazakhstan, and kind of, I guess, what we would expect there. Does this sort of crystallize what appears to be kind of a division of labor between Russia and China, where China buys the stuff from Central Asia and Russia does the politics and the security? And so that's the first question: is that sort of harmonious with this overall seeming division of labor in the region? And then the second question for you is, any impact of all of this on the Uyghur issue in China, given that you've got thousands of ethnic Kazakhs in Xinjiang who have either left or have tried to leave to avoid Chinese repression? Or is this just something that happens outside the borders and is immaterial?
Sure. On the division of labor thing, I mean, I think those lines are always not so clear as a lot of people like to talk about them. There's always, some blurriness on there. You see things of China and Central Asia kind of dipping its toe more and more into security type stuff. And obviously Russia isn't just confined to, the military stuff, but that's certainly their two strengths, right? Like Russia has this very powerful military tool. It has a lot of political influence throughout the region, especially in Kazakhstan. And, obviously China's main power has come through its pocketbook. The Belt and Road Initiative, which was actually the overland component, was launched in Kazakhstan in 2013. She came to what was then Astana and launched it there. So Kazakhstan's always been this important launching pad and linchpin for a lot of wider Chinese economic goals. I think the Chinese reaction to all of this, I think, is pretty interesting, and I think it probably tells us a lot about the kind of wider China-Russia relationship, but also a lot about how Beijing sees Central Asia in general, right? So, you saw once Tokayev announced that he had called for Russian help through the CSTO, China had largely held off. The MFA had issued a very blanket, very muted kind of statement up until that point, basically saying, we're monitoring the situation, we hope for calm, and outside powers shouldn't intervene. Nothing big. After it became clear that the Russians were going to be coming in through the CSTO, the next morning, I think that was January 6th is when troops arrived. January 7th, she had a phone call with Tokayev. He then threw his support there. So, it was obviously watching what was Russia going to do. Once it became clear that the Kremlin had thrown its support behind Tokayev, Beijing was then quickly fell into line. Those first comments that came, in that phone call, she warned about, pushing back against color revolutions, a lot of this similar rhetoric that both Russia and China share, around the world, the things that they worry about and the kind of things that they're anxious about, and the drum that they both like to collectively beat, as two kind of like-minded authoritarian regimes. But I think what this tells us is that, China, Kazakhstan and Central Asia matters more to Russia than it does to Beijing. I think Beijing's top priority, it cares a lot more about its confrontation with the United States, and having a good relationship with the Kremlin is a great way to be able to do that. So, I mean, nothing in Central Asia, I think, will jeopardize the Russia-China relationship, or China certainly won't let it do it. It's fine to let Russia take the lead on these issues. If Russia wants to do the heavy lifting, why not? It's not really, China, I think, has shown that it's not really up for, putting boots on the ground. If you look at what happened in Afghanistan, I think there was a lot of speculation of, okay, is China going to get in more economically? Could there be more troops? But actually, it's China is extremely cautious when it comes to this stuff, and I think it's shown it's not quite ready to do that yet. And so if Russia's going to do that, that's fine. So I think that kind of tells us some interesting things about where they're headed. And if anything, I think this crisis is kind of bringing them closer together. You've seen Chinese state media have completely unified on this narrative. They're really hitting home all of this stuff, warning about color revolutions, warning about foreign terrorism. These are all threats that Beijing likes to hype up. So I think they're actually seizing on this opportunity and probably going to benefit from it, even though I would say that Russia really comes out ahead with elite politics. And yeah, maybe China loses some it had, you talked about Masimov having good connections to DC world. He obviously had extremely good connections to China. He's half ethnic Uyghur. His father's was from China. A lot of the Belt and Road and all of these big facilities that got the rail network that was talked about earlier of transporting Chinese goods through Kazakhstan to Europe. These are all kind of the brainchild of Masimov in a way. And so with him gone, I think, as the elite at the top gets rejuggled, China kind of needs to find its new kind of people who it can work through. But, Beijing's so important economically. There isn't really anyone else that Kazakhstan can turn to in the same way. Russia doesn't have the money. I can't imagine the West is going to turn to it like this again. So, China's not going to lose anything in the long run, I can't say. To your other question, talking about with the ethnic the ethnic Kazakhs, Chinese-born ethnic Kazakhs who have come over, there has been a lot of activism within the country over the last several years. A lot of people have relatives who have disappeared into the camp system in neighboring Xinjiang. You also have a lot of people who have come over and claimed asylum within Kazakhstan, ethnic Kazakhs who crossed over. And then you also have some people who are in camps themselves who, a much smaller number, but who managed to come out. In terms of how I see that playing out, I would just say there's going to be a general, Kazakhstan's going to get more autocratic now. I can't see this leading to an opening of the country. And that means just across the board, there's less space for dissent. And that's doubly going to apply to the China thing, which, Kazakhstan before would always skirt this line. I think that there was sometimes, the authorities would really kind of back off. It would get into tricky nationalist issues and in internal politics about how quickly you could press down on the ethnic Kazakhs who were protesting and raising the alarm about what was happening in neighboring China. And I know this was a big sore spot for Beijing for a very long time. Kazakhstan did move to shut down a lot of this, the government, and a lot of activists that are no longer in the country or, have had their offices seized and things like that. I talked to some people on the ground when all of this was happening, trying to figure out what is going to happen to them, people who have been in Xinjiang, people who are activists on this issue, because there were some kind of unconfirmed reports and rumors circulating that amid all the chaos, perhaps, Chinese security officials operating out of the embassy, trying to get some of these people back to China. There are some reports of the KMB, the Kazakh domestic intelligence, trying to, pressure people to head back to China as well. But I haven't been able to confirm any of that. So at the moment, I don't think there's been any movement on it, but I can't see, this becoming an easier place to talk about China. If anything, it's going to be much more difficult. And I think that that window was already getting closed, and I think it's shut now.
Paul, let me ask you about this Russia-China set of activities. So Reed was describing kind of what has happened. Do you see this as sort of follow the leader or actually coordination between Russia and China? And then the other part of that is, there have been predictions for a long time that China's increasing interest in Central Asia and Russia's persistent interest in Central Asia is going to lead to rivalry between the two there, which wouldn't necessarily be bad for the United States. If we use this as a small test case, it doesn't seem to have exacerbated any rivalry, but maybe had the effect that Reed described, which is actually kind of put them closer onto the same page. But how do you see that, both with respect to this particular instance and the region more broadly?
Yeah, no, I would agree a lot with Reed, and on the China front here, I think China had to tread very carefully in this situation. China, there are certain big risks for the Kazakhs here. The big risks by inviting the former colonial power back in. There's a rising Kazakh nationalism that is geared at times against Russia, but there's far more anti-Chinese sentiment in the country, particularly over the Uyghur issue, particularly over China's huge economic footprint. Several years ago, there were large-scale protests over fears that they were going to sell, land to Chinese, and then there's probably a weekly protest in front of the Chinese consulate in Almaty before these events. So I think having the Russians come in was certainly safer for the Chinese than China, and there's certainly a lot less they're not welcomed with open arms by average Kazakhs, particularly Kazakh-speaking Kazakhs who are more nationalistic than Russian-speaking Kazakhs. But it is certainly a way in which the situation is stabilized, and China didn't have to take any heat. I would also agree with Reed too. Kazakhstan has been one of the countries that has been managing China and managing this Uyghur issue and the ethnic Kazakhs fleeing quite carefully. It generally does do the right thing in providing them quiet asylum or providing them a ticket to another country that's a little safer. There are other countries in Central Asia that have been accused of sending these people back. Tajikistan is one of them, and I am sort of worried about, given the sort of the increased pressure that Russia and China might have. As far as Russia and China, working together and coordinating, I don't see this pretty much as coordinating. I think everybody was caught by surprise. I think China was happy to let Russia take a back seat. And on the idea of certainly there will be frictions, and I think there are certainly some frictions in countries where China has a bigger security footprint. I think there's a lot more pushback, and concern about their footprint in Tajikistan, but in Kazakhstan, the Chinese have not had a huge security footprint. Their footprint has been economic primarily and diplomatic. And as far as whether this can be an area where we can work, where there could be fissures in the future, I think both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, we're trying to figure out whether that would work. And I'm sure Lisa Curtis can talk about that. I just remember from when I was working at the NSC in 2012, we've long thought about our can we act diplomatically on those fissures, and I don't think so far we've been able to figure out a way to do so effectively. So I think that could be something we can do in the future, but I think particularly right now that's a big challenge, particularly if we pull back from the region.
Lisa, let me go to you with a question from the audience, and then maybe you can also come in if you have a view on this issue of, Central Asia is the area where the U.S. could drive wedges between Russia and China, given potential rivalry and all of this that Paul just talked about. So Alice has a question. Do you expect a price tag for greater Russian intervention, greater integration into the Eurasian Economic Union, involvement in the economy, political price tag, or is this sort of a freebie? I'm paraphrasing. Alice didn't say that part of it, but is this a freebie, a free service that Putin is extending to a neighbor in crisis?
Yeah, I really don't think so. I think definitely this will signal Russia strengthening its influence over the region more broadly, and specifically with Kazakhstan, and what their specific demands might be moving forward. I think it's difficult to say, but I am particularly concerned about the fact that Russia and China have these congruent interests, and that in fact, instead of the fissures that Paul mentioned, we pretty much have seen the opposite. We've seen converging interests in Central Asia, in protecting the authoritarian leader from protests, and trying to box out the U.S. or Western influence from the region. So unfortunately, I see more converging interests than diverging interests between Russia and China in Central Asia right now. I don't think there's anything that the U.S. can do to affect this equation, quite frankly. I argued strenuously in my previous remarks for continued U.S. engagement, looking for opportunities for trade and investment, continuing our C5+1 engagement. So I think all that kind of positive engagement, we should be stepping up and continuing. Central Asians welcome it. As I indicated, they see their relationship with the U.S. as strengthening their own ability to protect their independence and sovereignty. So we should keep moving forward on that front. But in terms of any potential friction between Russia and China, The U.S. is not going to be able to impact that, I don't think, one way or another. It may happen, as China asserts its economic interest more and more in Central Asia. How will Russia feel about that? Were Russia to extend its presence in Kazakhstan, which I don't expect, but were it to do that, how would China feel about that? We've seen that the Chinese have a nuanced approach to Ukraine. They haven't totally taken Russia's side on that. So I think that whatever happens between Russia and China in Central Asia will happen independent of U.S. policies. But I think that one of the other questions in the chat that was raised is, will this encourage Uzbekistan to now join the CSTO? And I think this is a very interesting question. We've always thought of Uzbekistan as being a little bit more independent of Russian influence. But I have to think that they are watching very warily what's happened in Kazakhstan, and that they would not, if there are similar protests that they face in Uzbekistan, that they would want to be on the right side with Russia. So I think this is something we should watch very closely. And unfortunately, I think that right now the other Central Asian states are kind of seeing the tea leaves as moving toward Russia's power and influence growing in the region. And again, I come back to the United States has a role to continue to have a presence there and nurture our partnerships and relationships, and also to monitor closely and demonstrate that we understand the region and we understand what's happening there. So I think that has become even more important following the developments in Kazakhstan.
Paul, let me go back to you for just 1 second before I go to Andrea on a couple of questions. On this question of driving wedges or pursuing fissures in the Russia-China, do you agree with Lisa that it's not that the stuff we've done hasn't been successful because ignoramuses have implemented it, or because we haven't thought of the right stuff, or we haven't pursued it with sufficient vigor, but those opportunities really aren't really there to be had, although it sounds nice that we would use Central Asia as sort of a chip in a way to push Russia and China apart at a time when they seem to be growing closer together?
I would agree with Lisa. I don't see the wedges as really there. I think there's growing synergy. There certainly could develop. I mean, I think there was also growing synergy, a desire to get the U.S. out of the region that went back, to the Bush administration. Getting U.S. troops, out of. It was clear they didn't want us to stay when we first went into Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. We finally left Kyrgyzstan. We left Uzbekistan, and then we left, Afghanistan. And just this past year, and I think, particularly for the Central Asians, the withdrawal from from Afghanistan and the way in which it played out in the end, was a message that we did not see this area as a prime area of interest, sadly. And I heard that message from many of my interlocutors in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, particularly even more often in the frontline countries. And I think what I hope that we do is I think we've been solely focused on Ukraine for obvious reasons. There's clearly the threat there, but I think we need to be able to be able to focus on Ukraine and also be able to focus on Kazakhstan. I think we do have some leverage here. We don't have the same leverage that the Russians do. But I think, when I've been at similar conferences that Lisa Curtis has been in, and when the Russians and the Chinese and the Central Asians, they talk about the region, they always want to talk about geopolitics. They don't want to talk about the intrinsic problems of the region. And this all started because of a huge socioeconomic wealth gap. It started because of bad governance. It started because of empty promises. This is a country that for years promised to reform. People were getting wealthier and wealthier, and they never reformed. And what the events of the last few weeks show, Almaty had a really charming, budding, small business, boutique shops, everything. They've all been destroyed. We're seeing capital flight going out of the country. It's mainly going to the West, so I think we need to, watch that. But we're also, seeing the shutdown it's badly damaged the investor climate, and we're the ones. When they look to how to run things, how to reform, it is the population that looks to the examples, towards the West. We have the capability, and the Russians are not, and the Chinese are not going to be dealing with, those issues that would help make this, more, bring it the sustainable change that President Tokayev, at least in his speech yesterday, indicated that he wanted. Whether or not he is capable of doing that, the country certainly needs it, and the country certainly needs something to shore up its economy right now. It was already badly hit from sort of fluctuations in energy prices and then the pandemic. But now this is, I think we're seeing a huge sucking sound of trade and investment and capital flight. And how do you sort of improve both the governance, address that socioeconomic wealth gap, and do it in a way, where you're just not targeting the rich and redistributing to other rich, but targeting, redistributing it in an equitable way that could deal with some of those underlying issues. And I think we're the ones that have the greater expertise and the greater ability and the greater will to do that. There are also some other allies. I mean, I think Kazakhstan has long been engaged with Singapore, Japan. Those might not be pushing the same human rights values, but they're certainly pushing rule of law type values. And so there's certain ways in which we can, we don't have to do this all alone, but I think we can collect our European allies, Asian allies, all of whom have interest in the stability of this region, and have investments there, and maybe work on that end as well.
Andrea, there's a question from Christopher in the audience. Do you think Putin saw himself as intervening on the side of Tokayev against Nazarbayev, or was this more about putting down a challenge to an authoritarian ally, no matter who made the request? And you may also have a view on the pattern of Russian behavior in terms of this price tag question. I mean, is this a free service that Putin is likely to provide to a buddy, or what have they wanted, if anything, in return after they've stepped in to help someone out in a situation like this?
So on that first question first, I guess my sense is, and I think others have made the point, that we still don't know a lot of what's happening behind the scenes and kind of what is happening between the elite factions. But I think first and foremost, this for Russia was about shoring up an embattled authoritarian system. I think the worst thing that could have happened from Russia's perspective, I think, is if you have this massive outpouring of people in the streets and you have some leader from outside of the ruling elite who has the potential to take over and take Kazakhstan in a different trajectory. So Kremlin's preference was to ensure that this someone from within the ruling elite, that they are able to manage this transition. If it's away from Nazarbayev, they want to ensure that it is a known quantity and someone who is going to be willing to sustain the contours of Kazakhstan's foreign policy. So I think first and foremost, it was very much about shoring up an embattled dictator and ensuring that these contours of Kazakhstan's foreign policy remain intact. But I also want to pick up along the lines of this authoritarian politics. Reid made a really interesting point about the fact that then things are unlikely to democratize or kind of improve dramatically. And if anything, this is going to be a hardening of authoritarianism in Kazakhstan. And I think, the empirical record would support what Reid is saying. So in that same project that we did when we were looking at the trajectory of countries, in terms of what happens after a long time, highly personalist leader leaves office, is you tend to either the regime persists or you get a new form of authoritarianism in more than 80% of the time. I think when it's a longtime leader who's in power 20 years or more with an aging leader, the prospects of democratization fell to just 8% of cases. And so this does, again, it suggests that even though, had this protest and presumably a transition from the Nazarbayev family to a new leader, Tokayev, who's been able to consolidate control, the authoritarian system lives on. So, and I think just for Moscow's perspective, ensuring that the kind of general logic of the system persists, and primarily that the foreign policy contours remain intact was the number one priority. It is, an added advantage now that I think that Tokayev is largely indebted to the Kremlin. I mean, in doing this, Tokayev now was able to take a highly unanticipated situation and opportunistically push the Nazarbayev clan out and consolidate control for himself. And so for that, I think he is indebted to the Kremlin. I agree with Lisa. It's hard to know exactly what that price tag looks like at this point, but the Kremlin it's not for free, that's for certain. And they will be looking to kind of call in and cash in some favors in the future. I think another thing that we heard is, that when Lisa was talking about now Russia's role in the region, the fact that we're even talking about Russia's influence in Central Asia increasing is, I think, somewhat remarkable. I mean, there's been a lot of people who have talked about recently how Russia's influence is on the decline, right? That fewer people are speaking Russian, China's influence is growing. The kind of trajectory of this conversation has been in the other direction. And by taking this very opportunistic move to shore up Tokayev, again, signaling that the Kremlin is a reliable partner who's willing to shore up its friends and partners, that I think it has turned the tide in many ways on Russia's trajectory in the region. I think it sent a credible signal, and getting back to this Russia-China point, it has reinforced Russia's role as first partner. So I think all of that is kind of remarkable that it's come, so quickly in the wake of this. So I think it's a really interesting pivot point in the region.
It is kind of remarkable how Russia, over and over again, with relatively few military resources, is able to change narratives and sentiment and perceptions of presence or absence. I mean, including in the Middle East. When you went to the Middle East at the height of the Russian involvement, the number of American forces in the Middle East and the number of bases and the number of relationships dwarfed anything Russia was doing. But one heard consistently, America's leaving or has already left, and Russia's the new player in town. And it's fairly skillful statecraft in that respect, I gotta say. Lisa, let me come to you on something though. So you and Paul laid out that very compelling, admirable agenda of items that the United States maybe uniquely could push with respect to Kazakhstan and the region, socioeconomic conditions and corruption and human rights and things like that. Mm-hmm. Reed and Andrea, I think, are suggesting that situation's likely to get worse, not better, because they're going to come out of this more indebted to Russia, more authoritarian at home, probably more paranoid about any domestic turmoil, and therefore, closer to crackdown and closer to keeping, the elite close to the vest. So where does that leave our policy? If the object of our policy is retreating in distance, what can the United States reasonably seek to achieve in its relationship with Kazakhstan?
Well, yeah, I understand Reed and Andrea what they're saying, and certainly the research suggests that you're going to see a crackdown, and they're not going to give an inch. Or if they do anything, it's going to be sort of window dressing. But I guess if you look at what's happening with the populations, youthful population, a fairly vibrant economy, people making more demands, they're seeing the lifestyles of the leadership. It's creating dissatisfaction. Something has to be done with that. And so I don't think it's going to be so easy to ignore the voices of the Kazakhstan people. And here I'm not saying that the US, needs to run out there and be, pouring resources into civil society groups, that kind of thing. I think we need to continue our voice in support of human rights, supporting civil society, but we need to be very careful and sort of humble in our approach, I think, here. And but I do think that there are some things that we can do, that we can offer, and I just don't think we even the Kazakhstan leadership will be able to ignore the demands of the Kazakhstan people. I just don't think that's going to be so easy to do. I think that you'll probably see a balancing. Yes, there will be some dues to pay, debts to repay to Moscow, and perhaps even China. Reid talked about some of the things that we may see happening in terms of the ethnic Kazakhs from Xinjiang province. So there may be some debts to pay, but at the same time, they can't simply ignore this sentiment that's coming from the Kazakhstan people, and they're going to have to deal with that in some way. It's interesting how the first president, Nazarbayev, tried to handle his transition, kind of stepping down from the presidency, yet keeping a very strong role in the political setup there. All that's changed now. I think, clearly Takayev's been able to consolidate his position. But I think at the same time, having Nazarbayev now completely out of the picture does open up some opportunities if President Tokayev would want to take them to make some changes. And in fact, he has talked about corruption. He has talked about economic, equalization, or, dealing with some of the economic problems. So I guess I wouldn't completely dismiss that he could take some of these actions. But certainly, those actions are not going to be encouraged by outside regimes. The United States will continue to stand up for human rights, but I think it's more the internal push and, a recognition. I think there is some recognition among the leadership in Kazakhstan that changes are being demanded, that they can't really continue to ignore.
Well, I think I saw you nodding a little bit, and so I want to bring you in on this, and then Andrea, let me go to you. But I want to maybe stretch the U.S. policy question just a little bit to put kind of a fine point on it. So, are we sort of left with a situation where the Chinese approach to Kazakhstan is, we'll buy as much stuff as you can get out of the ground, and we won't criticize anything you do to your people? The Russian policy is, we want to be there to support you, including with troops if there's ever any domestic turmoil. We want a political relationship. And the American approach is, you got to change your human rights practices. You got to crack down on corruption. Inequality is a problem and things like that. Like what should be the objectives of U.S. policy? Like, why is it in the interest of the United States to have a closer relationship with Kazakhstan or a more distant relationship with Kazakhstan?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. First of all, I just wanted to. I think I agree with everything that everybody has said. Russia is certainly reasserting itself here, and China probably has that effort to do. And Russia is certainly showing that it is willing to back, authoritarians who are in trouble. But I think Lisa Curtis is 100% correct in that this has been a regime, this has been a government for the last decade, I would say, that has been in trouble because of the rising socioeconomic problems. That I think, part of the reason Nazarbayev stepped down is because they were getting very difficult to deal with. And I think everybody thought Tokayev was going to be a transitional figure, that, he could transition out, he could do the reforms, and then somebody else could come in so he could take the hit. A couple things happened. The pandemic, number one, complicated that. And then, Nazarbayev, to be honest, he had COVID too. He got frail. He kind of stepped out of the picture. And I think that may have destabilized things. But those fundamental issues are still there. And they're not going to have the help of Russia. And I think they're probably even worse. The second issue, I think, is there's a robust civil society. Despite all the repression in Kazakhstan, the Kazakh civil society is really robust. They've got great ideas. Not everybody is out there wanting to overthrow the regime. They want stability. They want better lives for their children. They want better education. There are certain things that the Kazakh people have demanded. It's not necessarily we want free elections. I don't think anybody expects free elections there. But if you can get education working, if you can get the healthcare system working, if you can get crime down, I think that's the type of stuff that I think Tokayev can work on. I understand also that there's been a lot of friction between not necessarily Tokayev and Nazarbayev, from what I understand, but between their two teams. And so whether or not Tokayev really is a reformer, now we'll see. But at least there's been people around him who said it's been difficult to push that because of all of those issues. As far as where we can go, I think part of our identity is to promote human rights, and that's just something we do. But I think we can do it in very deft ways. This is about governance. This is about economic opportunity. This is about the rule of law. These are about things that the Kazakhstani government for years has said they want to improve. There's the Kazakhstan the Astana Financial Center that has British law that's supposed to be able to arbitrate, business agreements. Well, that says a lot for the Kazakhstani legal system, that it actually has to have a specific one center where they have a fair and equitable legal system. So I think we can certainly continue to push and continue to focus in on the internet. Internet's important for human rights, but it's also important for investment. And so I think there are other channels. We can push on the human rights, but we can also push on the governance. We can push on this is what brings stability. And I also think we have some baggage. The Europeans certainly have some baggage because of the human rights. Some of our other partners around the world who also have deep interest in this region may not have some of that baggage, but their end on rule of law, their end on corruption might be very similar, and we can sort of work through them. So I don't think we need to lead out in front, but I think we certainly need to be involved in this issue and to focus in on areas, the socioeconomic, the governance, the areas where I think we can make more progress and where we're likely going to be able to help the Kazakh government meet those demands. Or we're in a better position to help meet those bottom-up problems. That is what is going to be needed for the stability.
Andrea, did you want to come in on this?
No, I think the only small thing to add is just not to be misinterpreted by saying the way I think the trajectory is likely to go. And I think what I'm saying wasn't, and I certainly wasn't making a causal argument, but basically just saying that these are the baseline odds of how dynamics tend to play out in regimes that look like Kazakhstan. But that doesn't negate the fact that we don't try to do all of the things that Lisa and Paul said. And if you can understand the logic of the regimes, Paul obviously talked about anti-corruption. That's important domestically, but it's also really important in the West, right? That we are anti-kleptocracy initiatives so that we stop Kazakh elites and Russian elites and other elites from benefiting from the open societies in the West. Those types of things are basically enabling and facilitating their kind of hold on power domestically, doing things to support civil society so that you do develop alternative centers of power. So I was just wanting to correct the record that my remarks weren't intended to say oh, it's unlikely to go that way, so we throw in the towel. But we need to understand the way things tend to play out, understand the logic of these regimes to kind of shape and inform what our approach is. Because and you can think of it as a long-term investment in the region, that these are things for all of the reasons that Lisa and Paul have said, because Kazakhs are demanding more for their governments, we should be there to support those things. But we should know that it's likely to be a longer-term proposition rather than just, oh, we're shifting from Nazarbayev to a new government. And, isn't it going to be great? There'll be some wonderful opening. I think it's a longer term proposition, but it doesn't mean we don't try to do all the things that they eloquently laid out.
So contra my summary of Andrea's remarks, she is not a fatalist on this. She does not believe the die is cast, and she does believe there's merit in the effort. So
thank you for correcting the record.
Anyway, any mischaracterization is my fault, not her articulation. Lisa.
Just really quick here. But, as we do try to support Kazakhstan, maybe nudge them toward these political economic reforms, we have to be cognizant of the nuances here. Yes, the Kazakhstan people's demands are real. There's need for change, but also really bad actors did get involved in these protests, and they really did manipulate the protests and sort of take them in a very bad direction. And I think we have to keep that in mind as well. And I think if we have that sort of more nuanced approach, the Kazakhstan leadership will be more receptive to our engagement.
Yeah, that's a good point. Reed, I want to go to you in a minute, but Paul, did I see you gesticulating on this one, or are you okay? Okay, all right. Sorry, maybe you were gesticulating for another reason, but not on this particular question. Okay, so Reed, there's a question from the audience here. Rick asked, do we know what kind of operations the CSTO actually conducted in Kazakhstan, so kind of on the ground, and was the Wagner group involved? So do you have any sense on that?
I mean, from everything we've seen, I mean, there's, Wagner Group is officially a private military contractor. I mean, this was all done officially through the Russian militaries, the Russian, paratroopers and army who went in there. And actually, from what we've seen, all the reports from both the Russian forces and also the other countries that were there through the CSTO, I mean, they largely played, laid back. They were guarding big, airports, big important sites to free up Kazakh forces, who then went out onto the streets and, across the country and played a much larger role in putting down the protests. So, I mean, there hasn't really been anything to show that actually Russian forces did anything kind of forward leaning or as far as we know, even fired a shot. So.
Okay. And I don't know if you have a view on this, but Guadalupe asks, did the West underestimate Russia's military mobilization and logistics capability? So I guess was the deployment, the ability to deploy so quickly a surprise? And I don't know.
I mean, maybe some of the others on here who have experience in U.S. government could speak to that better than I do. But my sense is, I think everybody's quite aware of, I think whether you've looked at Syria, whether everything we've seen in Ukraine or elsewhere. I mean, the Russian military, I think nobody's really underestimating it anymore, and I think it's shown that it's quite a capable force, and especially for short-term, quick operations like this are quite skillful.
I don't know, Paul or Lisa, if you guys would agree with this, but the thing that seems surprising to me is not the ability that Russia was able to put boots on the ground so quickly, but it was able to cobble together a multinational coalition that had never deployed together in lightning speed to be able to do this. Did that strike you as remarkable, or is that kind of just me?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say that what strikes me as more remarkable is that how quickly a Central Asian nation called on the CSTO to get involved and come in within its borders. And I think the thinking was that when these nations joined CSTO, it was largely to placate Russia, that, it wasn't really going to do anything. And, wasn't that meaningful of an organization. So I think that's what's more surprising, is that, a nation actually invited CSTO into their country. But Paul, you may have a different view.
No, I would agree 100%. What we saw a year ago, that Russia could mobilize the peacekeepers and get them into Armenia within 24 hours. So the ability to do that, the ability to get the rest of the CSTO, particularly two states that particularly didn't want to go in, Armenia and Kyrgyzstan. It took a few extra days to get Kyrgyzstan on board. I think that's the interesting question. The other question that I think is really unanswered is, yes, why did Mr. Tokayev call so quickly? It was basically the end of the really first bad day of violence. And there are certainly lots of speculation about the bottom-up protests turning violent, leading to elite power struggles. We'll never quite know what exactly, or hopefully at some point there'll be a real investigation and we'll actually know what will happen. I'm not sure we did, but that's the strange thing. And so, and they also, Russia has long said it doesn't want to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. Well, stepping in as there's this power struggle going on, both. It seems like there might have been a request for some help, and they were perfectly willing to go in, and they shored up, Tokayev against the Nazarbayev faction. We'll see where this goes, but I think it's going to be a couple months, if not both for the domestic situation to play out, till we start getting answers, incredible answers. The holes, there's so many holes about the coup attempt that they call it. There's also many holes in the foreign fighter attempt that the Kazakhstani government says. So there's real questions that need to be answered here. And I think first the Kazakhstani people want stability back, then they want the questions back, they want the answers, and then they want, let's figure out our way out of this mess. And I think, the politics inside Kazakhstan are still very uncertain. And I think that certainly will create uncertainties for the relationship between Kazakhstan and Russia as well moving forward.
Reed, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think that it shows a kind of like a more mature approach from Russia to not only mobilize the CSTO, like if we think of how Russia behaved in previous interventions, look at Georgia, which is just okay, we didn't like what you were doing, so we're just going to send in the whole military here. Whereas this, it's officially multilateral. And yeah, the bulk of that is Russian troops. The second highest are Belarusians, who Lukashenko, I think, is much more in step with Putin than he's ever been these days. But still, and then I think also branding it as a peacekeeping force, I think is quite good. I think going in and coming out quickly. I mean, Russia doesn't need to stay there. It doesn't need to occupy Kazakhstan. When you have a government that's going to play ball with you, why bother doing that? And I think it's also, again, going back to our earlier conversation about China, I think the fact of saying that this is a peacekeeping force, that's something that's easy to sell, that China can sell its own people. And I think that's also something that's easy for Moscow to sell to the Chinese. That's sort of one of the few acceptable forms of intervention in kind of Beijing's official rhetoric is peacekeeping. And so the fact that the Russians are doing a peacekeeping mission, if you, again, look at how Chinese media have been talking about it everywhere, it's actually, there's a lot of praise for Russia and what Russia did to stabilize this and how the Russians are peacekeepers actually in the region. So I think it shows this is this isn't the Russia of 2014 or 2008, right?
All of this also maybe shows just how full the U.S. foreign policy plate is going to be indefinitely into the future. I mean, everyone wants to pivot to Asia and focus on China relentlessly. And then we've got a Russian army on the Ukrainian border for real. And, the people not that long ago didn't expect Tigrayan rebels to be at the gates of Addis Ababa, nor did they expect them to be fended off with foreign drones supplied to the Ethiopian government and a humanitarian crisis there. And certainly no one seems to have anticipated that we would all be thinking about, talking about, and spending time and energy on Kazakhstan even a few days ago. But that's the way the world goes, and it shows some of the complexity and challenges associated with being, I guess, a global power with interests around the world. Thank you all for joining this. This was extremely illuminating on the situation in Kazakhstan and the implications thereof. There may be more to come after this, given some of the questions that remain outstanding and the implications that are not yet settled. But Reed, Paul, Lisa, Andrea, thank you all for joining us today. And thanks to everybody in the audience for tuning in and for the good questions. And we will see you all at the next CNAS event like this. So have a great day.
Thanks a lot.